welcome, Dr. Eleonore Fournier-Tombs. Really delighted to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk about this topic, which is, I think, a topic that has gotten a lot of attention at the UN General Assembly and all of its associated events this year, which is artificial intelligence and global governance.
Absolutely. It's been a really big year for that. So it's kind of an exciting time to do a bit of a postmortem after the UNGA.
Right. And you've, worked on this issue for a really long time. You've worked on data science throughout your career in the UN system. How have you seen this conversation about the need for digital governance on AI develop over this time period?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think when I started in 2010, 2011, we were really focused on open data. And so it was really about transparency and government data and open UN data. And then when we started applying a lot more artificial intelligence models, so we did a lot of machine learning, predictive analytics, predicting humanitarian needs during a natural disaster, predicting movements of migrants and refugees. We did a lot of work around COVID-19. And that's when you started to see a movement towards the governance and the ethics of AI. But it came really in a grassroots way, which is, I think, something that not a lot of people realize, is that the data scientists working in these fields, particularly at the UN, started grouping together and developing working groups on data science ethics. And so I started working on human rights and AI, gender rights and AI, privacy protection around 2016, 2017. And some colleagues at IOM actually created a working group.
And IOM is?
IOM is the International Organization for Migrants.
Okay. Thank you.
And so they have a lot of data going on predicting migration flows and all kinds of things like that. And they created an interagency working group on humanitarian data science ethics. And that was the beginning. And then we saw a progression in 2021. You had the UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of AI. European Union also moved with the Draft AI Act at the time. And then we started seeing this bubble up and becoming a kind of a bigger issue. And then when the G7 in Japan in 2023 started calling for a global governance of AI, then at the Secretariat, it became kind of urgent. And then the last year has been every single resource on global AI governance. So it's been kind of a process.
Yeah, but it's an interesting process. I mean, it sounds to me like the people who had the most knowledge of how these tool sets were developing were the ones most concerned about their potential impact. And that is a really kind of subversive way to look at this issue. I think for so many people, AI, because of its technical nature, feels very separated. Like it feels like something that's given to you from a black box, when in reality it's evolving through these types of conversations in data science.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I've always been a little bit against this whole black box idea, because I think it kind of makes it difficult for us to really grasp the risks and the concepts. I think if you really take a different approach and think about it as a technology that we developed and something manageable and so on, then our means of regulating and governing it can be much more proactive and evidence-based, rather than just kind of hype-oriented, which is something that I see a lot and is kind of worrying in a way, because we just become afraid and sometimes we feel helpless, which isn't really how we should feel in relation to a technology that we actually developed and we ultimately have ownership over.
Right. Technology is a tool.
Yes.
It can be used for lots of different purposes. And we're going to get into some of those purposes, the risks, and also the opportunities as we talk. But I did want to touch on the Global Digital Compact. So the Global Digital Compact, it seems, is one of the major outcomes to come from the Summit for the Future. That there's been this movement of UN member states to coalesce around a set of principles, a set of, directives on how we should bring global governance to the digital world. And there's a wonderful policy brief that was prepared in advance of the summit that outlines several ways in which AI governance has become dangerous or risky. I'd love to hear from your perspective, like, no hype.
Yeah.
What are the real risks today of AI and of AI being unregulated?
It's actually a kind of a difficult question in the sense that, there are a lot of risks because it's a very powerful technology and it's deployed in a lot of different sectors. I think an interesting angle is the risk of erosion of multilateralism and global coordinated action. And I think that actually encompasses a lot of the other risks. If I can explain. So, at the UN and in international global multilateralism, we focus on values, on norms, and on global objectives. And those are really touched by AI risks. So you have the possibility of erosion of human rights. You have the possibility of accentuation of inequality. You have threats to the environment. You have a lot of threats to peace and security. So there's, where AI can be deployed and in a harmful way. And there's also all of the biases kind of that are potentially in AI systems.
Right.
And so that's a kind of a framework that I would look at. And a lot of the people that are worried about catastrophic risks, they're also very worried about AI being used almost as independent actors in our society, in participation in content creation and a shifting of norms and disinformation, and the impact that could have on democracies. And I think additionally, the impact that those kinds of things are already having on multilateralism and on things like universal norms. Right. Where we actually accentuate polarization and we might be less capable of coming together as a global community and setting objectives together or the way in which we want to learn or want to live. So that's kind of how I would frame the main risks of AI. So our objective is really at the UN, you need to set a kind of a framework, an umbrella for a lot of the different initiatives and make sure that there's no gaps in coverage, that every country, if you're a citizen of a country that doesn't necessarily have the same regulations as another country, that you can still have some protections, set the stage a little bit for the cooperation between countries. So there's a lot of kind of meta work that has to be done at the UN in regards to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. The way that you frame it, that the risk is erosion of multilateralism and coordinated action, it really speaks to me to two things. One is like the AI tools are really taking data and giving that data in organized ways to decision makers, right? So it's really the decision making that comes from the AI tool set that is like the point of judgment on whether or not it's working well.
It's true.
And then, of course, there's the trust issue. How do you kind of separate signal from noise in a time when machines can generate their own content? Yeah. And know what's a trustable source or not? So these are massive questions that it does feel like the UN is well placed to convene conversations about in that meta way and make sure that, there's information sharing, best practices, all of that good stuff happening so that member states can have the best chance that they can to kind of manage these decisions well. I think that if I can, I'd like to get a quick overview, because it's my own personal interest, of your PhD work. Okay. Which speaks to some of these questions about trust and democracy. And tell us a little bit about the model you developed and how it can be applied with regard to like trust between societies and governments.
I mean, how much time do you have?
I have unlimited time, but a few minutes.
I've always been really interested in deliberation, and I actually did my master's thesis and my PhD and my postdoc kind of on the same theme, which is the idea of measuring deliberative quality. It's a very kind of niche area, but it's kind of a field in political theory where you think about the settings for deliberation and how to kind of optimize them. So how to make sure people can participate and you have a variety of perspectives and that, people are working together towards a common good and not doing positional politics and not really converging. And the idea with this kind of framework is that you want to create a kind of a setting where people are going to come together with solutions or policy decisions that are hopefully more representative and optimal. And so there's actually an index that was developed in 2003, so kind of a little while ago, that attempts to measure these elements. So you take a kind of a deliberative context like a parliamentary debate, and then it gives you like little codes, were people respectful? Were people considerate of a global perspective? Did they change their perspective based on other people's opinions? So like very kind of narrow elements. And so for my doctoral and my postdoctoral work, I applied machine learning techniques to doing that coding. The reason why I did that is to be able to do it at scale. Right. So all of that work originally was done manually. So you would take every single kind of speech and then manually code it, like many social scientists do. Right. And so doing it with machine learning allowed us to code maybe 200,000 speeches and go a lot faster. And then you would get a score and you'd be able to compare different deliberative venues. Right. So we worked on, because I ended up collaborating with a lot of people on this, but we worked on the Canadian North and comparing different parliaments, Indigenous parliament versus a more partisan-based parliament. And the idea is always to be able to think about, once we have quantitative metrics for this, how are we able to set up deliberative spaces that really allow people to participate in the most inclusive way? And so that was the work that I did.
That's an amazing story. And I think, a really good example of how machine learning can help like optimize for democracy, trust, all of these other things. Yeah. Here at the Policy Institute, we focus quite a bit on climate issues. We're looking at raising ambition. We're also looking at practically how do we implement solutions for climate mitigation, adaptation, resiliency. And I think you've done some work on the alignment of AI with some of these issues that we cover, particularly climate governance. And in one article that you were co-authored, you mentioned that climate change is not referenced on the level of a strategic objective in the Global Digital Compact, but that this type of initiative holds the potential to create impact on climate if it's harnessed intentionally. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your thinking on this, like unpack this for us a little bit so we better understand the link between what AI and Global Digital Compact can do and the climate crisis that we're all facing.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Global Digital Compact, there is some mention of environmental, concerns and climate concerns, but it's a little bit separate from the artificial intelligence section, which is section 5. Basically, there's a lot of opportunities of AI for climate action. And it's, as you mentioned, it's one of the big challenges that we face today. And so one of the ideas is to really think about all of this money and enthusiasm that we're putting towards AI and take at least, direct at least a part of it towards solving the climate crisis. And so there's a lot of different ways that AI can help. There's, as with climate, there's a framework where you think about prevention of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and AI tools can really help either optimize energy processes or develop early warning or early action systems, all kinds of different modes of using AI tools for climate action. And what I would have liked to see is a little bit more of directing the global community towards these specific actions. So in the article that you mentioned, I talk a little bit about a specific mechanism through which this could work, would be to harness and support local AI ecosystems. So we often talk about AI being developed only in certain areas. And often when we have briefings, with member states, they tell us that they don't have any AI in their countries. And actually, a lot of times they're not correct with that. They may have a lot less resources than in the United States and maybe less big billion-dollar companies, but they're still developing some really interesting tools. And a lot of capitals globally, for example, Jakarta does a lot of things, and Nairobi and so on, will have an ecosystem of AI development, which includes the academic sector, maybe some startups, funding or support from the government, an AI strategy, which a lot of Southeast Asian countries have, or almost all, and other actors, venture capital and so on, and they come together to support the development of new AI tools. And so that vehicle is important to acknowledge so that we can then think about, harnessing resources to support them to grow and give them even more resources. And then thinking about, can these be used as tools to develop AI specifically for climate action that can be appropriate for the local context? And so I think that could be an opportunity. If we, as a result of the Global Digital Compact, want to spend a lot of money and do capacity building and, fund interesting initiatives for the SDGs around the world, I think that could be a really good way of doing it.
Yeah, it seems like there are that an ecosystem, an AI ecosystem could be a really good point of influence. Yeah. It's the place where all these things are already coming together. Yeah. And then therefore it's an efficient, almost optimized way of making sure that the qualities, the values, the objectives of the UN and the global, which are the objectives of the global community and the UN member states, are realized, as you said, in a local context, which I think is also really important. Obviously, there's going to be kind of different standards, ethics. Culture is going to play a role in how AI develops in any given place. But at the same time, it seems like there's just this ample space for best practice sharing, a data for a smart city that optimizes energy efficiency is, kind of culturally neutral. It could be applied in different contexts. Right. There's also, of course, the role of artificial intelligence in kind of economic and strategic competition. I do a lot of work on U.S.-China relations. AI comes up a lot as both a topic that the U.S. and China should discuss more, but also as one of those key friction points of competition. We've noted that the Global Digital Compact outlines an intention to support interoperability and compatibility of AI governance approaches through best practice sharing and promoting common understanding. How do you see the prospects for AI governance, interoperability, and compatibility, when we have these two major powers, number one, number two economies in the world, that are vying for technical and technological dominance on this issue at the same time that the rest of the world really needs, the countries to come together and refine this AI technology toward common good? Yeah.
Well, I think I can answer that question maybe kind of if you take the risk management angle. Okay. There's been a lot of development in the last year of national AI safety institutes. So the US has one, the UK has one, and many countries around the world have them. And in a way, it's become, it has a potential to be a network and a kind of a new multilateral relationship vehicle. And the reports from the different national AI safety institutes could potentially bubble up to a global report. For example, the Global Digital Compact proposes the creation of the International Scientific Panel on AI. That would be a report that would come out potentially every year. Where would that data come from? That data could come from the work of the national AI safety institutes. And so I think that China has also been quite interested in mitigating AI risks and governing. They've come up with a lot of different types of guidelines and regulations. The way in which they categorize AI risk is not completely different from the way in which it is generally categorized in other countries and the way in which the US does with NIST, the National Institute on Standards and Technology, and the US Executive Order on AI, which talks about AI risks. So I think that there's potential for cooperation specifically between these AI safety institutes. I think it could be interesting if all countries that created these institutes include China and include any actor in their kind of cooperation. Right. And so the UN typically really wants all member states to be present and wants to be as inclusive a process as possible. Right. And so we're always advocating to make sure that all parties are at the table. And so I think that could be a possibility if it actually, if the US, for example, agrees to include China at the table. And I think that you see a willingness from the part of China to be part of that global conversation. And you see it in the way in which they've started to structure their activities and their regulations. So
yeah, actually, from my perspective and understanding, China's quite a bit ahead of the US when it comes to regulation. So perhaps there's mutual learning there on what works, what doesn't, et cetera. And that could all be built into an inclusive system. There are, a lot of countries, however, maybe Southeast Asia is indicative of this, that are still in the early stages of AI regulation. And they particularly don't have effective mechanisms to mitigate the risk technology poses to women, women who are often marginalized in these societies. What can you tell us about the risk that AI poses to vulnerable groups like women in developing countries, maybe specifically in Southeast Asia, because this is another subject you've written on? Yeah. Let's just start there on the risks, and then we'll talk about policies.
So like everything AI is kind of both sides. It's the risks and also the exclusion from the benefits, the kind of lack of harnessing the opportunities.
Right.
AI tools, if they're not designed properly, they have, usually I categorize the risks in terms of discrimination, stereotyping, and insecurity. So discrimination, there's tools, for example, starting to be adopted around the world, including in the Philippines, for example, or in Indonesia, where you use an algorithm to rank candidates when they apply for jobs, for example, and then do a long list, and then the hiring manager gets a long list. I think we're all kind of familiar with this example at this point,
right?
But it's really common, and it's still not something that has fully been addressed. So people around the world are uploading their CVs, and they don't really know what's happening to them. And often they are being processed by an algorithm that does have the risk of discriminating against women and any other kind of historically marginalized group that might not be represented in the data.
Right.
So this is a really, really big risk, because not having access to jobs at the same level is an additional contributor to socioeconomic inequality of women.
Yeah, it's going to amplify what's already happening.
Exactly. And so AI is being used for hiring, it's being used for decisions on loans, all those kinds of really important things that really can have an impact on a woman for her entire life. Right. If you didn't get that really great job, or you didn't get access to that loan, your life can go in a completely different direction.
Right.
So that's one of the areas. Another area that I started working on a couple of years ago, but it's much more important now, is a stereotyping.
Okay.
And so particularly generative AI tools have a tendency to stereotype women and any, again, historically marginalized group, people of color.
Right.
And for women, the risk is kind of constraining women in roles, in traditional roles in which they're not economically empowered. Okay. So creating content that really relegates women more to the care sphere and the private sphere, and not to, leadership roles, technology development roles, and so on. And since a lot of our content is becoming AI generated, we kind of get a skewed vision of what women are like and what they should be doing. And that can affect women in terms of their sense of self, and it can affect men in terms of how they treat women. And so that's a really big concern. And it has an impact also on Southeast Asia, because some of the groups, like Indigenous women in Thailand, for example, are even less represented. So this general idea of, the stereotyping of 50% of the world population, smaller groups get even more stereotyped or not even included or discussed in mainstream information sources because they're not being included by AI.
Yeah. And maybe so not participating in technology at the same rate, and also not participating in the development of the AI tools that would then make them more visible.
Yeah, so that's one of the elements. I think the stereotype element is just the way in which people are portrayed.
Right.
So the kind of ideas or preconceived notions that people might have because they're getting this AI-generated content that, portrays a certain group of women as very, very submissive or, erases an entire population,
It's distorting all these stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we interact with each other.
Exactly. And the exclusion element is important also because, as you mentioned, I worked as a data scientist, so I think that certain AI tools are super helpful in terms of making predictions and being able to plan decision making and plan development interventions or humanitarian aid. But at the same time, if women are not part of these development teams and are not part of decision making around them, the tools are going to be only kind of targeted towards a certain segment of the population. So we might not get as many tools on women's health, for example, or promoting women's safety, like ride-sharing applications that are insecure for women, for example, is very common.
Right.
And then we also have a higher tendency to be blind to the other kinds of biases that I talked about, like discrimination and stereotyping. And finally, we don't as much get access to the economic benefits of being part of the AI labor force, because right now it's very dynamic. So if you're in AI and you're a developer, you actually can make a lot of money and you can build some really creative and innovative tools. And so all of those things make it really important for women to be able to participate. But typically, women don't really have access to venture capital funding or those kinds of things to develop their own tools and to lead in these domains. And so in Southeast Asia, many of the countries that have some technical capacity, so there's so much variety in Southeast Asia from Singapore to Timor-Leste. So, but kind of
huge
in the middle,
development spectrum
is so different.
And different populations, again, different cultures, yes.
Yeah, so most countries have an AI strategy. In the AI strategy, typically there'll be an ethics component. So it'll say, we want to protect human rights and these kinds of things. Typically, I don't think I've seen any outright reference to women's rights and women equality. It might be kind of changing, but so far it mentions just general protection of human rights without kind of a specific gender module. And I think that it would be important in Southeast Asia, maybe kind of across the board, to have modules where it applies the strategy and the ethics specifically to an issue like this, which is so critical. And kind of give specific guidance on how to think about developing AI tools that don't discriminate, how to think about the inclusion of women in the workforce, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that obviously there is a human rights element of this that is critically important. We want to make sure that the global population is included. But it seems like it's also a completely missed market opportunity too. I mean, women are 50% of the population, make a lot of financial decisions. Feels like they're, that the AI ecosystem, especially the private sector ecosystem, would be really missing out if it follows these distortions down the path.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
So you spoke a little bit about access to VC, perhaps like making modules that are specific to a lens of looking at this issue, whether it's women or other ways that we could kind of parse down where is AI working and not working. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about how this connects to the Global Digital Compact. Like, how will the mandate of the compact and the ecosystems that it's developing, how could it kind of be directed towards these things? And, how do you see that developing?
Yeah, so in the Global Digital Compact and even the Pact of the Future, so the Pact of the Future is the main outcome of the General Assembly, and then the Global Digital Compact is one of its annexes, and then gets in a lot more detail on digital governance. There is certainly mention of women's rights in it. It's kind of, both of them have sprinkled around things like, we value gender mainstreaming, we value women's rights, we want women to be fully able to participate in technology developments. We want women to be represented in data, which I thought was really important as well. So it's sprinkled throughout. And so I think that a lot of these issues are raised. But it really depends on how it's going to be implemented and who's going to monitor this. So at the moment, we have the GDC, and member states have endorsed it. And there's been, a lot of multi-stakeholder participation. So private companies have participated in its development, and civil society organizations, and so on. Because I think the women's rights component is a bit kind of scattered all over, I think somebody's going to have to bring it together and think about what are specific indicators that each country should be hitting in order to address these. And that's really, really important. And that's really going to come in the implementation phase. So it could fall through the cracks unless there's either an organization, UN Women could do it, or, a group that pulls these different elements together and says, okay, so for a country, here are your targets. Because one of the things that the DJC doesn't have is indicators, right? So the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, have specific measurable indicators. And you can track each country, where are they on track based on their statistics office and so on. And so how are we actually going to track this success in the implementation of the GDC? We keep saying, for example, we're not on track with the SDGs. The only reason we know that is because we're measuring it. Right. So we could actually do nothing with the GDC, and then would we even know that? Whether any country did anything or not.
Right, or so everyone could claim success at that point, right? Even if they've done nothing.
Exactly. So that's kind of one of the big things with AI, I think, is that we keep saying that it's so complicated and complex, and then it's just difficult to actually get evidence for every single thing that we want to do and risks that we want to mitigate and so on.
Right.
And so I would say that the GDC is a really good opportunity because it was, a kind of a really comprehensive pact. Here are the main issues that we want to work on, and a lot of commitments, like specific things that are going to be done. Like this international scientific panel on AI, or a global dialogue on AI, or these kinds of things. Then I think we need to think about timelines, which I think the UN Secretariat is going to work on. And we need to think about indicators. And I think for anything to really move for women, we really have to pull it together and have concrete indicators, and then countries can follow them. Right. And I think it's the same for private companies too, because having worked as a developer, generally people working in technological development, if you give them as requirements, like these are the things that you need to hit, and these are specific kind of standards or requirements for the tools that you're developing, they're happy to implement it. It's just that they need the kind of clear guidance in what exactly are we trying to achieve. And then, they might be more able to hit these targets.
Right. So it's a number of things that need to be done. It's the development of targets, perhaps, or at least measurable results.
Yeah.
And we might be perhaps overthinking how complex AI is. Like maybe some of the standard tools that we use to monitor all of our goals would be completely applicable here, as well as like frameworks given to people who are working on AI tools, just like we give frameworks to people who are working on policy.
Yeah. For example, a tool that you can use in any project management or project development is gender by design or gender rights or gender equality by design, a checklist of things that you should check, go through when you're developing a tool. And it raises the awareness of the company or the developers that are doing it. Okay, so when they're testing their AI model, they need to test it on an equally representative group.
Right.
When they're putting in data, they should check that the data is relatively heterogeneous and like these are the specific checks that they could do. They should think about the impacts on women's safety. Like there could be specific checklists and then people are implementing that.
Right.
A lot of the risks that I mentioned, like the discrimination and stereotyping risks, are accidental. Okay. It's not that people hate women and then they didn't, they wanted to harm women's socioeconomic participation. Is that they just didn't think about it and then it kind of happened. And then we found out after. Yeah. Yes. Especially for the hiring thing. Like it's probably been going on this whole time. Right. A lot of people have written about it. The first known documentation of this that I know of is from 2018, which was reported by Reuters, I think, that Amazon was using a discriminatory algorithm in its own hiring practices, which is interesting because Amazon is actually the company that has the lowest percentage or ratio of women in its technical development team. But they were very criticized because they were like directly discriminated against women. So the tool was saying, if you're a woman, you're like in the exit pile. Wow. So they had specific ones. They said if you went to Barnard or in other women colleges, it would remove you. And it would remove you also if you said that you played in a female sports team. So like captain of a female football team, then it says female in it. Because usually your CV doesn't say female in it. So how would the AI know? But in this case, and so then it would put you in the trash pile.
I see.
And so these kinds of things,
That sounds less like ignorance by design and more like a deliberate attempt. But
I don't think they're like, okay, let's just make sure we never have women hired.
Sure.
I think they're just like, I don't know.
Here are things that are kind of exclusionary for us. And they all just happen to be things that women are doing.
I think they just didn't check. Yeah. I think that they had a data set that maybe like ended up having some women on, that didn't get hired, that were from these, that did have this background. Okay. And they probably didn't have enough women in the data set to balance it out. Okay. And the AI model ended up being trained on these specific aspects and saying, we're going to exclude them. And because women get hired less often, then you kind of start getting a bias of like, if women get hired less often, maybe women shouldn't get hired. Right. And AI is not smart. So AI kind of does those kinds of things. Right.
AI is not programmed to check itself in these ways.
It wouldn't check itself unless you check it.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we need an AI tool to govern AI, machine learning.
Well, you can do technical things. Yeah. Actually, at Hugging Face, which is a software and AI development company, there's some cool work being done on actually doing like real technical checks of data sets and models in a way that doesn't discriminate. And they provide like a lot of toolkits that are really interesting and implementable.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it's good to hear that that these are risks that, perhaps were unintended, but they are being discovered. Yeah. And as they're discovered, people are opting out of things like put all of the women's colleges in the trash bin. So very good to hear. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the entities that have been set up by the Global Digital Compact. So you had served as a research lead on the UN's AI advisory body. So I think you're well versed in how these governance structures kind of work together. Yeah. The Global Digital Compact has established a scientific panel, which you briefly discussed, the Global Policy Dialogue on AI, and then a Global Fund for AI Capacity. Tell us a little bit about how they might support the work that you had done as research lead on the AI advisory body. Like what do these other functionalities bring to the table to address some of these key issues?
Okay, so I'll give a bit of context. So when the G7 in Japan and made a call, there was a call for global AI governance, and then several companies like Microsoft and started saying we need a global AI governance. the Secretary General said the first thing that we're going to do is create this AI advisory body for the UN. Mm-hmm. And so they picked 38 people mm-hmm. that were gender and geographically representative mm-hmm. or balanced. Mm-hmm. The objective was to have them come together for 1 year. So they started working in September of 2023, okay. and they just wrapped up their work now with the General Assembly. And they were sometimes nominated by their member states. So sometimes it would be, the Minister of Artificial Intelligence, right. Or sometimes it would just be an academic expert or, corporate, like AI company representative. Mm-hmm. So there was a real mix of different people. And they met several times in person throughout the year. So in Geneva, they met in New York, they met in Singapore, and then they had calls throughout. What they did is that they put together a kind of report that you have online, which gives the ideal recommendations for AI governance for the UN system. Okay. In there, they put more things that are in the Global Digital Compact. So they had a wish list of 6 or 7 items. Mm-hmm. Some of those recommendations made it into the Global Digital Compact. Mm-hmm. And that's what you're mentioning. So right. The first thing that made it into the Global Digital Compact is this creation of an international scientific panel on AI. Mm-hmm. So the idea here is taking the idea of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to have a technical consensus of scientists globally on what are the risks, opportunities, and trends in AI. Mm. And that way we have a kind of scientific basis from which to start working on our governance. And with climate, it's comes out every 6 to 7 years. Mm-hmm. So that's the main difference. And it's also intergovernmental. In this case, it's international, which I guess means multi-stakeholder, mm-hmm. not just governments. Yeah. And then it also, they're aiming for it to come out every year. Okay. I thought it was a little fast, but everybody thinks that it needs to come out every year. Yeah. So we'll see. Okay. And so that's one of the main things that is coming out. Then, as you mentioned, there's a kind of global convening on AI at the UN that would happen every year.
Around the time of the General Assembly, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is important to have, bring companies and bring mm-hmm. civil society organizations to the table with governments and right. really have a big concerted dialogue around that. Mm-hmm. And then in a separate section of the GDC, mm-hmm. They talk about developing a global fund for AI for sustainable development. Okay. And so that's a little bit less of a clear commitment, and it's asking the Secretary General to make a decision on the creation of this fund. Mm-hmm. And I think the opportunity there is to really harness private and public financing to the Global South to increase AI development and support local AI ecosystems, right. and particularly for the SDGs. Right. And so all of those elements were part of the recommendations of the AI advisory body. Now the AI advisory body either will take a different shape or kind mm-hmm. of is closing its activities, publish its reports. And then now the UN Secretariat will focus on the actual implementation of these recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke a little bit about the timeline and I think there's just a huge sense of urgency on this issue in lots of ways. Like maybe a report every year is a lot to put together but things are changing so fast, exactly. It seems. Yeah. And I note that a lot of the requirements for member states in the data governance agenda of the Global Digital Compact, the requirements are to take concrete actions by 2030, mm-hmm. Which is about 5 years' time. Yeah. What would you prioritize? If you're like a smaller country or you're a member state that's being pulled in lots of different directions on this, what do you think are kind of like the big things that countries could do in the next 5 years? I'm not being predictive and understanding that things change rapidly over time, mm-hmm. but looking at it right now.
I think that's a really amazing question. If it was me, I would start thinking about this concept of the local AI ecosystem, because I think a lot of small countries can really do a lot in that domain. And so I would have a government strategy around supporting them. I would try to attract maybe foreign international investment to help them grow and foster, because I think AI is a real tool for innovation. And so you also kind of need to create a little bit of a space for the innovation to come out. Then I would try to prioritize these ecosystems or kind of guide them to certain priorities for the country. So I mentioned climate action. There's a lot of other areas of policy importance for different countries, depending on what it is, whether it's poverty reduction, for example, or gender equality, or those kinds of things, education. And so you could pick a few of these specific themes and orient at least part of your AI ecosystem to resolving or addressing some of these issues. And then I would look at the whole issue of data governance. And so with data, there's a lot of different issues, just like AI. There is the question of ownership of data. There's a question of representativity of data sets. There's a question of privacy also, which people are extremely concerned about. We're concerned, you and I.
Yes, and probably
everyone around the world are concerned about that.
Sure.
So those are the kinds of things that I think I would focus on first if it was up to me.
Yeah, and then the UN can be a place where people are taking those best practices and kind of resharing them with each other to, again, like to be efficient, right? Yeah. To see what worked before and adapt it to local context.
Yeah, I think that there was a hope that the UN might be able to implement something like the the implemented EU AI Act, which with clear regulations and an impact, if you don't follow the regulations. So in the European Union, you would be fined severely if you don't follow the specific regulations. But because different countries are taking such a different angle or philosophical approach in terms of AI governance, it's not going to be possible, I think, for the UN to take that approach.
Right.
But it can definitely help kind of shape what are the priorities, what are the key issues, make sure that every country is represented in the dialogue and the consensus building around AI issues.
Yeah.
And so that's a space I think that's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. We're coming to the end of our interview, which is sad for me because I feel so much smarter than I did at the beginning of this hour. But, tell us about your other big takeaways from the Summit for the Future. Like, what do you see as the lasting impact of this gathering? It can be on AI or other aspects of the Summit for the Future.
Well, I think in terms of lasting impacts, I think we're only getting started. It was really... For so long, we were saying that, the UN and the global community was doing nothing on AI. And I think now it's like a really clear first step. And I really believe that next General Assembly will also be on AI and will continue to work on these issues. It might be a continuously changing technology, but we're only just getting started. And so I feel optimistic that there's been so much conversation around this and enthusiasm that a lot of key issues have been addressed. And there's also an issue that we haven't discussed, which is the military uses of AI, which I think are also urgently addressed in the Pact of the Future. And there's a desire to also think about those kinds of challenges in terms of AI used in warfare. So I think there might be a lasting impact on multilateralism and international law of having so much conversation and dialogue around AI. So we might start seeing, maybe re-looking at the Geneva Conventions or looking at, human rights, but in an age of AI, and maybe an additional convention. So I think there's still room for a lot of other mechanisms. I don't think that it's closed with the Global Digital Compact. I think it's kind of the opposite.
Right. It's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning.
That's really interesting to think about. Like, do we need to update some of the conventions of the UN, including Geneva Conventions that, govern how you can treat people in wartime?
Yeah.
through the lens of AI. So I hope we'll be able to have you back sometime to talk about progress on those types of issues. Been a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure as well. I loved it.
Great.